I played The Last of Us when it came out in the summer of 2013, right before my senior year of college. Despite the hype and praise it was getting, I was taken aback by the slower, more deliberate pacing and the emphasis on storytelling rather than action. Now, for some context, my library at the time was almost exclusively sports games, so basically 2K13, MLB The Show 13, NCAA Football 14, and the like were all that I was playing, with the occasional Fallout 3, New Vegas, and Alpha Protocol sprinkled in for some good old-fashioned action RPGs. It also didn't help that just a few months later, GTA 5 came out, completely blew me away and consumed my life, and made me forget that any other game ever even existed. All of this is to say that I didn't think very highly of The Last of Us, and while I recognized it was a well-made game, I probably would have given it a 6 out of 10 at that time. But things change, times change, and people change. Because I'm no longer that 20-year-old dumbass, my opinion of The Last of Us has changed as well. I picked the game up for the first time since that summer, partly in preparation for Part 2, and partly because of how much I've read and watched about it over these past 7 years, and was completely knocked off my feet by the incredible narrative and intense combat, in both shooting and stealth sections. I realized too how influential it has been and continues to be, inspiring games like The Evil Within 2 and Days Gone, just to name a couple. So much has been said about this game already, but even if I don't add anything new to the conversation, I feel it's important to conduct the analysis anyway, because, well, frankly, this game deserves it. So without further ado, it's no revelation that games are segmented into two segments, narrative and gameplay. I talked about this in my Mankind Divided video, and that the reason I enjoyed that game so much is because of how well connected and intertwined both of these segments are to one another. The same can be said of The Last of Us. When I first played through it, I didn't get into the story because I never got invested in the characters. This was because, like I said, I played games at that time for the action and gameplay. But I also didn't appreciate the gameplay because I found it tedious, monotonous, and frankly just plain boring. I didn't find it fun to constantly be grabbing ladders and planks and boards for Ellie to get across bodies of water. This time around, I realized that the story and gameplay are not distinctly segmented. Quite the opposite. Both systems are working hand in hand, and one cannot experience one without the other. You ever play a game where if you skip all of the cutscenes, it doesn't change anything about the experience whatsoever? Take Far Cry 5. The story sections and cutscenes don't really add much of anything to the game itself. If you took the entire game from start to finish, left the gameplay untouched, removed all of the cinematics and replaced them with scenes from Assassin's Creed 2, it honestly wouldn't change anything. You can't do this with The Last of Us because the entire game is grounded in the story. Everything, including the gameplay, is born from the narrative. So the inattentive, impatient little shit that I was back then completely missed the boat. But as I said, the gameplay is so interconnected with the story that much of the sections are actually the story itself. Those tedious sections I mentioned where you help someone up a ladder are only tedious out of context. Within the story, this is meant to show how cooperation is the only means of survival in this post-apocalyptic world. Individuals die, whereas teams survive. As the story progresses, these sections also demonstrate the changing relationship between Joel and Ellie, something we'll get into in much more detail in a minute. But these sections only make up a small part of the game when you step back from the trees. The Last of Us features some of the most intense and anxiety-producing combat I've ever experienced in a game. Even on lower difficulties, the tension and small margin of error are present, and on Survival and Grounded, your heart is racing and your palms are covered in sweat. The player's choice of deciding whether to utilize Joel's melee and shooting abilities, or choose to stealth your way through an area, does not detract from this tension. Because the game is so much grounded in reality, it doesn't take much for you to get killed. Similarly, enemies wearing body armor or infected enemies covered in layers of spores do not go down so easily when attacked via the body, but will go down with headshots. Enemies react realistically to downed comrades or the sight of Joel skulking about, so enemies must be stealthily taken down out of sight, and if their bodies are discovered, the remaining enemies search for you on high alert. Firefights have a tendency to turn into these great cat and mouse sections where you can use the terrain and layout of the maps to lure enemies into a more vulnerable spot. Enemies can also lose track of you, giving you the option to perform a stealth takedown despite the initial gunfire. Because you fight both non-infected enemies like hunters and military, and infected enemies, you will have to adapt your tactics depending on the circumstances. Different weapons will also prove better against certain enemies, and certain approaches will benefit the player as opposed to others. Additionally, the use of bottles and bricks adds yet another layer to an already intricate combat system. These objects serve not only as weapons but as modes of distraction. The ingenuity of throwing a bottle in the midst of a horde of clickers, then lighting them all up with a Molotov gives you this incredible sense of agency and immersion, not to mention how extremely rewarding it feels. You can also use these objects to stun an enemy, allowing for an easy takedown, although sometimes, if you do it too close to them, they'll just swat it away. Even within these two classes of enemies are multiple different types for variety. Runners are basically lookouts for the clickers, large husk-type enemies that can't be beaten down with fists. Bloaters serve as mini-bosses, and where they lack in speed, they compensate in brutality and long-range attacks. Stalkers are hyper-aware and ruthless in their pursuits. Even the non-infected humans have multiple classes. Hunters are typically unarmored, but the military is heavily armored, and by the time you reach the hospital, they have fully automatic rifles with unlimited ammo. The game also offers a wide variety of weapon types to accommodate your tactics. The 9mm serves as a weaker yet more of a rapid-fire weapon to wound enemies quickly. The revolver is much more powerful and, on grounded, will actually kill non-armored enemies in one shot. When fully upgraded, the hunting rifle is probably the most overpowered weapon in the game, able to take down enemies from both range and up close. Perhaps even more effective than the shotgun, although it is just grossly satisfying to blast groups of enemies away at close range. El Diablo is a super accurate and powerful handgun, while Shorty is basically a hand cannon. Then there's the flamethrower, which provides an effective means of dispatching hordes of enemies up close as they all burn alive right in front of you. Each weapon serves a unique purpose, making them all useful in their own way. But for me, the best weapon is the bow. When fully upgraded and stocked on arrows, the bow can be used to silently clear entire areas without anyone being alerted to your presence. This segues into perhaps my favorite element of the combat, the stealth. The Last of Us features some of the best stealth gameplay I've ever experienced, and part of the reason I didn't appreciate the game back when it came out is because I failed to use it. The stealth in the game is tactical, meaning you have to carefully plan out how you're going to go about a level before you do it. You need to take mind of the environment and where the enemies are located, as well as where their AI paths take them. It's within the stealth gameplay that you're taken back to the interconnected story. As I said before, teamwork is the only way to survive. It's amazing to see then that your NPC partners like Tess, Marlene, and Henry will actually perform takedowns simultaneously. Once you've studied the area, you can go to work taking everyone out with a mix of takedowns and the bow to avoid a direct confrontation and conserve your ammo. Which brings me into the final aspect of gameplay that makes it some of the best I've ever played, the exploration and resource gathering. I've spoken much about my love of exploration in games, and some of the games I've already mentioned, like the 7th generation Fallouts and Alpha Protocol, are so enjoyable to me because the items and loot found while exploring the worlds and levels are used to customize and upgrade your character. Once again, this was an element I glossed over the first time through. Joel can be upgraded and customized to fit your playstyle, and this is done with supplements found during exploration. The same works for his weapons, with crafting parts and tools found off the beaten path used to customize your weapon of choice to your liking. Training manuals also provide mass upgrades to categories like medkit effectiveness and blast radius for explosions. Since supplies are so scarce to fit the grounded in reality theme, exploration becomes much more than a mechanic. It becomes a necessity. Shiv doors are blocked off rooms that usually contain invaluable caches of supplies, and on grounded difficulty you're best to conserve all crafted shivs for the doors rather than the clickers. The scarcity of resources does two more things still. Emphasizes the connection between the story and the gameplay, since survivors in this world need scavenging to stay alive, and adds to the tension the player already feels as they progress through the levels. Trying to fight a bloater without ammo is not going to work. So rather than blasting all the infected outside the high school, you're best to use stealth to conserve your supplies, which once again accentuates the impact stealth has on the game. Do you see what's happening here? Every system is working together harmoniously rather than staying separate and distinct. I missed this 7 years ago, and it ruined my experience. There are even more systems too, like the incredible environmental storytelling. You've probably heard the oft-repeated rule of storytelling: show, don't tell. The Last of Us takes this to new heights, as much of the story is told without having to force exposition down your throat. Simply walking around the incredibly designed world tells you everything you need to know about the kind of people that exist. It gives tremendous insight into Joel's character, even without him having to say things like he was once a raider who ambushed passersby.
How did you know?
Know what?
About the ambush.
I've been on both sides.
Oh.
Joel does some despicable things, but you understand why when you see the world he's living in. Ellie is perhaps the most complex and well-developed character I've ever seen in a game, and part of it is the way she responds to the world around her. Despite only being 14, she's lived more of a life than most adults have in the modern times, yet she's still just a kid. This is revealed by her love of comic books and puns.
Okay, we need to lighten the mood. Ready? It doesn't matter how much you push the envelope, it'll still be stationary.
After helping Joel and Henry escape murderous hunters, she takes an action figure from a store and gives it to Sam, because she's just a kid. Seeing both Joel and Ellie travel together and respond to the world around them makes them relatable in a way that's very difficult when you experience all of the horrible things that they have to do. All of this is made so much more impactful with the incredible attention to detail given to all of the locations. Every single set piece calls to mind similar places from our lives. Each one is crafted with a level of specificity that immerses the player into the world in which they are playing. And this makes Joel and Ellie even more relatable because we get the sense that these two could very easily be us if such a cataclysmic event were to occur. And because of this, we relate to the experience of getting close to someone during times of intense crisis. The story is also filled with so many interesting themes and intricacies. The watch motif is probably the most obvious. Sarah gives Joel a watch for his birthday on the night that he loses her, yet he's kept it on for the 20 years since we last saw him, and all the way through to the end of the game. The way he touches the watch and looks at it despite it being broken, something which Ellie comments on the very first time they meet.
Your watch is broken.
Begs the interesting and unanswered question: when exactly did the watch break? Did it break the night of the prologue? Did it break sometime in the 20 years since we last saw him? Did it break in the few moments since he met Ellie? Joel has been carrying a broken watch around because it's the only thing he has to hold on to, which serves as a connection to his previous life before the world went to shit. There's also a certain gravity and levity in the way Ellie wonders how people in the old world could take so much for granted.
Is this really all they had to worry about? Boys? Movies? Deciding which shirt goes with which skirt? It's bizarre.
This is made even more unsettling when experienced during a global pandemic wherein we also can't enjoy the aspects of life we took for granted on a daily basis. When the Henry and Sam storyline ends so abruptly, it's indicative of the world these characters are living in. No one has time for grieving or mourning. The first time I played through it, I was unimpressed and wanted closure and clarity. But this simply doesn't work in this world. You experience loss and heartache, but you have to keep moving. It's the same with Tess in the Capitol building. When Sam and Ellie talk after escaping the infected, Sam is looking to Ellie for answers about the meaning of life, and he doesn't even know that she's infected. He's simply looking for someone he relates to give him a perspective that he can't see. There's the complexity of Bill, who despite his tough exterior shows vulnerability when he comes across his dead partner, which in turn serves as a sort of parallel to Joel and the way he is with both Sarah and Tess by this point. Even David has complexity that makes him seem somewhat relatable because you can easily interpret his desire to keep Ellie around as one of codependence, since he likely saw Ellie's ability to hunt and her eagerness to take care of some third person as an attribute that would benefit him and his crew. And ultimately, the David storyline brings Joel and Ellie together in a way that solidifies their relationship. Which brings me to the final element that makes The Last of Us such a great game and something that I've spent far too much time avoiding. What makes this game is the relationship between Joel and Ellie. It's no secret and it's been talked about ad nauseum over the years. But to truly appreciate it, you have to dig deeper than the surface level concept of man escorts girl through danger and they bond along the way. They don't just bond, but they actually become adopted father and daughter. This is not some generic zombie ripoff tale that we've become so numb to. This is a story about two people who, when they first meet, want absolutely nothing to do with one another. Even after a few hours, this is merely a job to both of them. Joel wants to get paid and Ellie wants to get to the Fireflies. But with each passing obstacle along the way, the two end up relying on one another. And it all feels natural. Ellie is so colorful and full of personality that she accomplishes something that would probably be impossible for anyone else to do. Crack Joel's impenetrable, tough exterior. With each passing season, the two let their guards down and begin to share more and more with one another. The first major turning point is when Ellie rescues Joel in Pittsburgh, and although he seems embarrassed by being saved by a young girl, he realizes that he needs her, and begins to trust her by letting her provide cover for him in the financial district. Then he gives her a handgun after proving herself an asset in combat. In the suburb section, Ellie jumps down from safety to stick with Joel when the ladder breaks. By Tommy's dam, Ellie has become so attached to and trusting of Joel, she doesn't want to leave his side even for a few minutes to eat, despite saying earlier that she was starving. She feels tremendously hurt when she discovers that Joel intends to hand her off to Tommy in the very same section, and it's here that the two have perhaps the most meaningful scene wherein both of their arcs fully converge.
Stop with the bullshit. What are you so afraid of? That I'm gonna end up like Sam? I can't get infected. I can take care of myself.
How many close calls have we had?
Well, we seem to be doing all right so far.
And now you'll be doing even better with Tommy.
I'm not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel, but I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
By the end of winter, Joel and Ellie have become father and daughter in all but blood only. The climactic scene reinforces this, with Joel carrying Ellie out of the hospital in exactly the same way as he carried Sarah in the prologue. In fact, the parallels between Ellie and Sarah are prevalent throughout the entire story. Both fall asleep with Joel by their side. Both are referred to by Joel as his baby girl.
You're my baby girl. Oh, baby girl. It's okay.
In the two scenes I referred to, Joel is carrying them away from danger, ultimately confronted by a soldier with a gun. But, in the end, he walks away with Ellie because he wasn't going to fail like the first time with Sarah. The final scenes show Joel lying to Ellie about the Fireflies, because that's what parents do. Protect their kids from the truth when it hurts. Joel and Ellie are perhaps the most well-developed characters in any media I've seen, period. Ellie is the role that Ashley Johnson was born to play, and I could not imagine anyone else playing that part. She gave Ellie so many different dimensions, from the precocious tomboy to the playful child, the loyal companion, and the curious intellect. I also remember very distinctly looking up the voice actor for Joel back when I played the game for the first time. I wasn't into games the way I am now and didn't really know much about the community. I'll never forget seeing a picture of a tall, skinny, platinum-haired Troy Baker and thinking, okay, there is no way that this voice came out of this person. Baker's performance as Joel is often regarded as his best, and it's due in no small part to the fact that he made Joel as complex as he is. Much more than just a gruff, hyper-masculine survivalist. There's a video where Baker explains that the anchor point of his performance was the fact that Joel had few moral lines left to cross, and Baker did an incredible job demonstrating that although Joel had done some despicable things to survive, he was not beyond salvation. When you add all of this up, you get a game that transcends a stereotypical third-person shooter set in a post-apocalyptic world overridden by zombies. This was the game I took it for 7 years ago, but I was wrong. I'm glad I was wrong though, because it made the recent playthroughs all the more enjoyable. I see now that the near unanimous and constant praise is deserving, because The Last of Us is a game that seamlessly blends its narrative with its gameplay, and tells a story about two people who bring out the best in the other, all while set in a world where it seems like nothing good exists. Yet these two characters prove just the opposite, and the journey that they, along with the player, go through is one that should be experienced by everyone.
And just so we're clear about back there, it was either him or me.
You're welcome.
I mentioned at the beginning that I picked up this game because Part 2 is right around the corner. Obviously at this point, major story leaks and spoilers have created this strange range of reactions, from some deriding the game and its purported message, to others saying they're glad they were spoiled because it saved them $60. I don't really care about any of that because from the non-spoiled content I've seen, the game looks like it will be a technical achievement to close out the 8th generation, and I bet the refined gameplay will be some of the best in recent years. But since we're 2 weeks away from its release, I do want to say one thing about Part 2 and make partly a plea and partly a prediction about the game's story. Much has been discussed about the ending over the years, and whether Joel was right or selfish to lie to Ellie and take her away from the Firefly base. There's also some ambiguity as to whether Ellie suspects or knows that Joel wasn't telling the truth to her, although this is never explicitly stated. The game spends an exorbitant amount of time hinting that Ellie knows that she is meant to die in order to save humanity. It's because of this that she appreciates life and all of the good that it has. That's part of the reason the story is so good, and why what I took 7 years ago as throwaway, meaningless, optional conversations and cutscenes, which are more about stopping and taking in all that is going on in the world, are much more integral to the experience. A major theme of the game is that it can't be for nothing.
We don't have to do this. You know that, right?
What's the other option?
Go back to Tommy's. Just be done with this whole damn thing.
After all we've been through. Everything that I've done. It can't be for nothing.
It's even the name of the Platinum Trophy. Part of the reason that Joel's actions can be interpreted as selfish, and why some speculate that Ellie suspects or even flat out knows that Joel is lying to her, is because Joel effectively robbed her life of the meaning that it had. She was meant to save mankind from the cordyceps virus and the horrible condition that it left the world in. But because Joel wanted to redeem himself from that awful first night in the game, he took all of that away from Ellie. So in a way, Joel's actions did in fact make it be for nothing. Part 2 is set 5 years after the events of this game. In all of this time, Ellie and Joel had to have had this conversation. The Last of Us exists as a brand today and has affected as many people's lives as it has because of Joel and Ellie. Sure, there are other elements that I've spoken at length about, but at the center of it all, and the catalyst which sets it all into motion, is the relationship between Joel and Ellie. My plea is that Part 2 will address this, but my prediction is that it won't. I predict that Part 2 will be exquisite in its gameplay, visuals, animations, music, and other aesthetics, but lacking in its story because it won't be about Joel and Ellie. I really hope I'm wrong, but we'll see. And one final point I want to make is that I understand that part of what makes the ending so good is its open-endedness and the fact that it's up to the player to answer these questions. But I feel that Naughty Dog would be remiss if it glanced over this major plot point and ignored what makes this franchise so meaningful to so many people. It's these two characters and the relationship that started from one of indifference and eventually became one of unconditional love, all developed in the most grounded manner possible.